All right, friends, it looks like we have a nice, healthy group. Folks are still logging in. I will monitor email and chat to see if folks are having any technical difficulties or have questions as we go along, but don't want to keep us behind schedule because we do have an excellent presentation today. I saw that Marie and Stephen are both on, so I will go ahead and without further ado, hand it over to them. I will stop sharing my screen so that you can go ahead and take the reins. But welcome to our June monthly Zero Suicide Learning Collaborative. Really excited for our session today. So keep signing into the chat. That's really helpful to get a sense of who all is here. So thanks for doing that. And I will stop sharing now. Hand it over to Marie and Stephen. I see your smiling faces. Thanks for joining us. So the floor is yours.
Great. Yeah. Good morning, everyone. I'm Stephen Hayden. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Envision U.
Hi, everybody. My name is Marie Hafner. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am a program lead with Envision U, primarily working on our behavioral health provider training program.
So we're so glad that you all are joining us today to talk about the impact suicide has on members of the LGBTQ plus community. So it may come as no surprise that lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer and questioning individuals, LGBTQ plus, are vulnerable to suicidal thoughts and behavior. In recent years, the media and social campaigns have highlighted the tragic suicides of several young LGBTQ plus people who have ended their lives because of relentless bullying or family rejection. Preventing suicide and enhancing resilience is clearly one of the most critical aspects of healthcare provision for LGBTQ plus patients. We have the opportunity to provide programs and care with the goal of promoting self-acceptance, positive social engagement, and improved mental and physical health of LGBTQ folks in our community. So today we hope to increase understanding of the stigma and disparities within the LGBTQ plus community, introduce a training opportunity for behavioral health care system, outline behavioral health best practices, and expand knowledge on the impact suicide has on the LGBTQ plus community.
All right, so to help with understanding the disparities the LGBTQ plus population faces, I'm going to start off with some statistics. So across the board, people in the LGBTQ plus community experience mental health challenges at higher rates. One Colorado conducted a survey of the community in 2019 called Closing the Gap, the Turning Point for LGBTQ plus Health, which is a really great resource. And according to that survey, about 55% of respondents had depression, about 50% had an anxiety disorder, and about 45% had some form of PTSD. And so obviously these are kind of some staggering numbers. And overall, LGBTQ plus individuals were more than twice as likely as their heterosexual counterparts to have a mental health disorder in their lifetime. LGBTQ plus individuals are also at a greater risk for substance use. According to SAMSA, about 18.3% of LGB adults in the US have a substance use disorder compared to 7.7% in the general population. And that also goes for opioid misuse, which about 9.6% of LGB adults experience compared to 3.7% of the general population. We've also got some statistics here about cigarette smoking, which occurs at a higher rate. About 20.5% of LGB adults smoke compared to about 15.3% of the general population. And according to the Healthy Kids Colorado survey in 2017, when asked if youth had smoked in the past month, about 15.7% of LGBTQ youth said that they had, along with 32.6% of trans youth, and that's compared to 5.9% of heterosexual youth. And just as a note, you'll notice that for the majority of these statistics, they include LGB adults, which stands for lesbian, gay, and bisexual. but only in the youth statistics are the T or transgender folks included. And in that statistic, the rate doubles for transgender youth.
Up and running. I needed somebody to join. So Missy, I'm like, I think we have to become friends on Facebook.
Sorry, I think someone is unmuted.
I never became friends with Patty until she left, and I was always like, but I was.
I can't tell who that is.
The host can mute everybody.
Okay, thank you. So as I was saying, so in that statistic that we have trans youth, it doubles. So across the board, usually the transgender members of our community are impacted by these disparities at higher rates, and yet so much of their experiences go unrecorded. They often get left out of research and data collection, which, as you all know, makes things like designing interventions and backing policy harder, which is just something to keep in mind moving forward. And here again, we have SAMSA's 2019 National Survey on Drug Use and Health, Lesbian, Gay, and Bisexual Adults. And here, this graph just kind of highlights the overlap of mental illness and substance use disorders for the LGBT population. So among those 18.3% of LGBT adults with a substance use disorder, 1 in 2, so half, struggled with illicit drugs, 3 in 5 with alcohol use, and then 1 in 6 struggled with both. And of the 47.4% of LGBT adults with a mental illness, 2 in 5 had a serious mental illness, and 12.9% of people had both a substance use disorder and a mental illness. So keeping in mind that this was 2019, and most of what we're seeing now indicates that these numbers are likely to have risen due to COVID. And also pointing out that the survey does not include transgender folks, which means most likely those numbers are higher for the entire community. And then finally, people in the LGBTQ plus community face higher rates of discrimination and mistreatment in healthcare settings. So not only are we impacted by behavioral health concerns at higher rates, but we are also less likely to receive effective healthcare interventions due to discrimination. So I'm just going to read some of these statistics here. About 8% of LGBT individuals said that a healthcare practitioner refused to see them due to their actual or perceived sexual orientation. About 23% of transgender individuals said that a healthcare practitioner intentionally misgendered them or used the wrong name. And about 8% of LGBTQ plus individuals avoided or postponed needed medical care, which increases to 14% for those who have previously experienced discrimination due to their sexual orientation or gender identity. And according to SAMSA in that same 2019 study, 86.4% of the LGBT adults with substance use disorders did not receive treatment, and 45.7% with mental health disorders, 45.7% did not receive treatment. So in a survey that Envision U conducted last year, overwhelmingly members of the LGBTQ plus community identified a need for culturally relevant and identity affirming healthcare providers. People who go to the doctor want to know that they will be treated with respect, that their chosen name and pronouns will be used, and that they won't have to come out to dispel an assumption of cisgender or heterosexual identities. So we'll talk more about what an affirming provider looks like later in the presentation. Now that we've kind of set the stage about why we're doing the work we do, we're going to switch gears and talk about some of that work that we are doing to address these disparities.
Marie, so as you all know, we're with Envision U, which is a statewide behavioral health initiative focused on improving mental health outcomes for members of the LGBTQ plus community. We're based in Denver. We're a 501c3. And got our start at the beginning of 2018. And we've seen really rapid growth, in part, unfortunately, because of the demand for our type of advocacy, education, and the training that we're offering. There's really 4 areas of focus for us. The first is around educating the community. So we know that when we raise public awareness around behavioral health concerns, we do that through a variety of statewide community-informed initiatives. Additionally, we promote policy and legislation that improves both access to care and advances equity for those living with a mental health or substance use disorder. The next area of focus for us is we encourage recovery. We know that seeking behavioral health support is one of the most difficult and important steps that a person with a mental health condition can take. And we work to empower individuals to find the courage to seek the support they need. I will say I'm a person in recovery and have previously experienced my own mental health challenges. And while I knew that things were disrupted in my life, certainly had people telling me that was the case, it took a lot of courage to ask for help. So we certainly want to be a part of that person's journey. We are focused on enhancing resources. And we collaborate with partners, including other nonprofits, government agencies, and institutions of higher learning to promote access to affirming and trusted resources while also advancing research, education, and training. And lastly, expand training. We recognize that admitting that you need help is one thing. Finding a welcoming and affirming provider to support the recovery process is often more challenging. So to address this concern, we've developed a comprehensive multi-level training program working with Omni Institute and a community advisory board to advance behavioral health interventions, improve outcomes, and ensure members of the community, the LGBTQ plus community, receive culturally relevant care. So this is just a good infographic that distills what we were just talking about. The one thing from a public awareness piece, we do have an active advocacy effort. We work with a lobbying firm here in Denver to make sure that we have ongoing conversations with policymakers and elected officials. So as they're thinking about mental health reform, looking at new policies, that they're keeping the LGBTQ community in mind. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our programs. So one part of our public awareness campaign is How to Have the Talk. This was developed in conjunction with the community. We certainly know there's a lot of campaigns focused on encouraging people to talk about mental health. We recognize the importance of reducing stigma. But what we did see is that most of those campaigns didn't really speak to members of the LGBTQ plus communities. This campaign, which was launched last fall, really speaks to the community, both in terms of the concerns that so many folks experience, but we also have used language and images that are relevant. Our next program is called Finding Hope. So this campaign was launched earlier this year. It's a partnership with the Colorado Health Foundation. And we've created a peer support program, and we've invited LGBTQ Coloradans living in Southeast and Southwest Colorado to join us. This is not a clinical initiative. It is led by peer community organizers who've received special training to facilitate these conversations around wellness and how to improve overall mental health outcomes. The next area of focus is that every year we sponsor the Colorado Behavioral Health and Wellness Summit. It's a partnership with the University of Denver. This year will be held October 25th through the 28th on the DU campus, but all the content will be delivered live virtually. And so it gives folks an opportunity to engage with some really incredible content. We provide the summit to the community at no cost, so there's really no barriers. We're also really excited that 2 weeks ago, we launched a comprehensive statewide research project called State of the State. And as Marie pointed out earlier, so much of the research that exists does not include the experience of transgender and non-binary folks. And we also recognize there's a gap in the research around Black, Indigenous, people of color who identify as queer. So we've been really intentional about working with community partners to design the survey and ensure that as we introduce the survey into communities across Colorado, that it is representative and speaks to the lived experience of the wide diversity of our community. So Marie's going to talk about our behavioral health provider training program.
All right, so our LGBTQ plus behavioral health provider training program, it was developed to address that need that we discussed earlier to help mental health clinicians, addiction counselors, peer specialists, social workers, pretty much anyone in the behavioral health care field to provide culturally relevant and identity affirming care to the LGBTQ plus population. So this program spent about 16 months in development. It was created in collaboration with the Research Institute Omni, which we work with for a lot of our programs. So we started by having Omni evaluate all of the training currently on the market. We didn't want to duplicate efforts if someone was already doing good work in this space, and we knew that we wouldn't be the first ones wanting to create training around this population. But based on what we found, we decided that what we had was unique enough to move forward. And what we found was that there really wasn't any training that was very intentional about using an intersectional lens, as well as discussing the importance of trauma-informed care. And both of those we think are crucial for working with LGBTQ+ populations, and both of which we're going to talk about later in this presentation. So after we decided to move forward, we put together a committee of people to help develop and edit the content, including people with lived experience, clinicians, people of varying gender, sexual, and racial identities. We really just wanted to make sure that our training was informed by diverse experiences. So we piloted this training in its virtual format last year, and we officially launched the training to the public in February of this year. So the training itself is split into 2 levels. Level 1 is offered in an on-demand virtual format and is more of an LGBTQ+ 101 course, and it's very foundational. And then level 2 is a 9-hour course, which is currently offered in a 2-day webinar format and goes much more into depth on considerations for providers on working with LGBTQ+ clients. And we are also going to, at some point, make it in person. Obviously, we weren't able to before, but an in-person 9-hour day course that people can take. So we identified some learning objectives for the training, some of which you'll notice have some overlap for our presentation today. I just wanted to go through some of these learning objectives to also highlight some of the needs that systems can address within their own practices. So the first one is to increase understanding of history, stigma, disparities, and the unique experiences and traumas of LGBTQ+ people. So knowing the struggles people in the community have faced and continue to face gives providers more of an understanding about what LGBTQ+ individuals are up against. The next one is developing an understanding of LGBTQ+ affirming and inclusive language. This is crucial to convey acceptance to LGBTQ+ clients, and it is often stated as one of the #1 indicators of whether a provider can be trusted with a queer person's care. They state that as something that they're actively looking for. And then develop a foundation that allows for deeper exploration of best practices for behavioral health providers. So we recognize that you've always got to start somewhere. And for those who aren't a part of the community or haven't interacted much with the community in the past, a lot of that information is new. And honestly, we've also had people who identify as part of the queer community who said they've learned a lot, because you can be like, if you can be like a white bisexual person and not at all understand most of the experiences a transgender person of color might go through. So starting by developing that basic foundation is important, just to also encourage further learning moving forward, because as we all know, learning is a continual process. And then we have increased understanding of the importance of a trauma-informed and intersectional lens in understanding LGBTQ+ clients. And like I said, these 2 focuses we considered crucial for working with the community, and we're going to go more into detail on those later. So the next one is enhance awareness of personal and systemic biases, how they influence institutional settings, and how to mitigate them. So as many of you probably know, being aware of your biases is the first step in addressing them. And there are a lot more of them built into administrative systems than you think. So through the training, we go through how to look at your biases and how to address them. And that goes from within your personal biases you might hold, and then in the places like systemic biases where you work and things like that. And then last one is expand knowledge on the cultural role of substance use for LGBTQ+ people. So as behavioral healthcare providers, it's important to be aware of that. We already went over the rates of what LGBTQ+ folks have substance use disorders, and it's pretty high. So part of what influences that number is the fact that a lot of queer spaces are not sober spaces. They're like bars and clubs. So understanding how that impacts recovery, as well as like support systems and things like that, is really important when you're treating an LGBTQ+ client.
Thanks, Marie. So there's a number of benefits, not just for the person that we're serving, whether you're a behavioral health provider or someone working in a healthcare setting. So what we know, and the research is clear, and anecdotally with folks in the community that we have worked with, it's important that providers foster a therapeutic alliance by affirming a client's identity and learning more about where they come from. We recognize that as providers, we are not experts in other people's lives. However, it's also not the role of the client to come into our setting and educate us about their experience. It shows a commitment to a client's recovery on the provider's part by learning how to promote practices that lead to better outcomes. I will say I recently switched my primary care provider, and I went into the office and immediately noticed that everything on the form that I was filling out was binary: male, female, husband, wife, all of the things that speak to a cisgender heterosexual experience. And so, imagine if you were trans or non-binary, and that was the first introduction that you had to that medical practice, would certainly feel very disconnected and a sense of likely not receiving the kind of competent care that you would be looking for. Providers and wider systems of care get value from being able to market that they've done more than just check the box. As we all know, it's very easy to go on to Psychology Today and other lists and check boxes saying that you're committed to serving the community. And while I appreciate folks being allies to the community, we recognize that's not enough. And from a professional perspective for licensed individuals, we do work with the University of Denver, the association, various clinical associations, including the APA, the NSAW, the American Counseling Association, to provide continuing education for completing training. So then the question is, what makes a competent provider? So One Colorado, in the survey that Marie mentioned earlier, closing the gap, talked to about 1,200 LGBTQ plus Coloradans. And within that survey, they asked what individuals consider qualities of an LGBTQ plus competent provider. So respondents defined an LGBTQ competent provider as someone who is comfortable with their sexual orientation and gender identity and ask about those identities. They also ask about the relationship status and use gender neutral and inclusive language when talking about this, as well as sexual and reproductive health matters. Parents are used rather than mother, father, for example, partner or spouses rather than husband and wife. Using partners or spouses with the S in parentheses, we're also using language that is inclusive of folks in monogamous or poly relationships. Overall, a competent provider has specific knowledge or training to deliver healthcare services to LGBTQ plus people. Some of these pieces certainly require a deeper dive. What does it mean to be comfortable with somebody? What does it look like to a client? Ethics of scope, a comfort level comes into play here as well. You're not always going to be comfortable with every client you encounter, and we recognize that. We also know that completing one or two trainings doesn't necessarily make a person an expert, but it goes a long way to not only demonstrating your commitment to serving the community well, but I think also setting you up to foster a strong therapeutic alliance. And so, part of that is, how do we navigate the discomfort that some of us may have when clients show up that have very different lived experience than we do? So of course, this goes without saying, because it's true for everyone that we meet in providing services. All LGBTQ identities are unique for that individual. This means you should never assume that a client's identity lies at the root of any challenges they're having. Clients will want or need the same things, even if they share identities. Clients will frame their identities or experiences in the same way, nor use the same language. And of course, we never want to assume that clients want to discuss their LGBTQ plus identities or need to work things out, right? Everyone is at a different place, and not everyone needs support around navigating these identities. Some recommendations include refrain from using gendered language until somebody discloses their pronouns or gender identity. And part of that is how you introduce yourself. So both Marie and I, when we introduced ourselves, said, you know, I'm Stephen Hayden, my pronouns are he and him. And similarly, by setting that sort of example up front, you are demonstrating that you're creating a safe space for gender diverse individuals. And it also gives the individual the opportunity to introduce themselves, their pronouns, as well as the name that they prefer to use. We want to consider the unique challenges of LGBTQ plus relationships without stereotyping or making assumptions. We want to validate LGBTQ's individuals, their unique strengths and resilience. You know, certainly folks that live in, within marginalized communities have a great deal of resilience. And when you hold multiple marginalized identities in your, sexual orientation or your gender identity, and then you add to that a behavioral health concern, we recognize there's a lot of resiliency in trying to navigate those various identities in a world that sadly is often very hostile. And we want to affirm and reward expressions of sexuality. So again, while that may not be our personal experience, it's important to make sure that individuals feel safe and comfortable talking about those experiences when they step into a clinical setting. So continuing on with administrative aspects, an LGBTQ competent provider should certainly have forms that list sexual orientation, gender identity, correct name and pronouns. One thing that we definitely have moved away from is this idea of preferred pronouns. It's not a preferred pronoun, it just is a pronoun. And relationship status, of course, too, right? So preferred pronouns, that implies that using them is a choice, and it's not. The two best ways to ask are either a blank space to self-identify, which we talked about, or a multiple choice option along with a space to self-identify. Survey best practices find that a multiple choice format that provides a variety of answers, for instance, man, woman, gender queer or non-binary, gender fluid, trans man, trans women, as well as an open space to self-identify, resonates well with respondents as the identifying of multiple diverse gender options, along with the space to frankly self-identify, signifies an openness towards a variety of genders. This may encourage more authentic and honest self-identification than when only providing a blank space, or the openness to genders is unknown. Additional components of LGBTQ practice in an administrative in administration include signage and posters signaling inclusiveness, inclusion of sexual orientation and gender identity in non-discrimination statements, along with affirmation of LGBTQ clients on materials, hiring of LGBTQ plus staff, and general staff trainings on competency. In terms of training, one thing to ensure is that this training is not only given to providers or direct care clinicians, but we think it's important for any training that you all conduct to support this community is that it's available to any staff who are interacting with clients in some way, which of course can be receptionists, aides and assistants, human resources staff, and billing staff as well. This ensures that staff across the board have the skills and training to use appropriate language, maintain a non-judgmental attitude, and avoid unnecessary questions, and understand the importance of non-disclosure. If a client is working to determine insurance needs, for example, billing staff should have the skills to ensure they are using proper language and can identify potential areas where they may be able to support the client in better understanding and navigating their insurance company. And of course, when creating a culture of LGBTQ plus competency, consistency and enforcement of policy is crucial. Practices should continuously work to assess staff's cultural responsiveness and provide opportunities for ongoing education. And in situations when policy or best practice is not being applied, have strategies in place for enforcing these matters. It can only take one negative experience to completely change the perception of a practice from a client's point of view. And what we know is that if a person steps into a healthcare or behavioral health setting, and they've mustered the courage and finally have that determination to address some of the things that are complicating their life, if that initial encounter doesn't go well, or if that provider is not well equipped to serve them, they don't often go back. And what we, of course, know is that those symptoms and concerns don't just magically disappear. So it's really important that we get it right from the start. And by doing so, we can start to address that person's need early on and prevent that person from ending up in a place of crisis where they're engaging in self-harming behaviors, they're having serious thoughts of suicide, or sadly in our community, so often happens that a person decides to kill themselves. So it's a phrase that I'm sure all of us are aware of, either through education or in the media. But so what is minority stress? So minority stress is the additional stress that members of a marginalized group experience because of prejudice and the discrimination they face. Another way to talk about it is as adverse social conditions caused by oppression of and discrimination against members of a marginalized social group by a dominant social group and its systems. You know, it's the experience and expectation of prejudice, discrimination, harassment, microaggressions, and rejection. So as an example, you're starting a new job, which of course can be really stressful, but starting a new job and being afraid to mention a same-sex spouse for fear of being fired is a combined stressor that individuals in same-sex relationships experience. And in fact, about half the states in our country, it's still permissible to fire somebody because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So minority stress proposes things like gender and sexual minority health disparities can be explained in large part by stressors induced by hostile, homophobic, transphobic culture, which often results in a lifetime of harassment, maltreatment, discrimination, and victimization, and may ultimately impact access to care. Before we dive in, we also want to share a quick note with you about the term minority stress. The term minority assumes that marginalized groups or communities are a small, offhand from what's normal. You know, the ruling class is actually a socioeconomic minority, but holds the majority of power. Therefore, the term marginalized is not accurate. So it's really not a matter of belonging to a group that's smaller purely in numbers or visibility, but it's about belonging to a group that is systematically othered and oppressed. So while, you know, however the use of the term minorities, how the research is framed, we want to be clear that we understand that using the term minority can be othering, but we'll be sticking with the term minority to accurately reflect how the research is presented on this topic. So it's important to recognize that one of the strengths of the LGBTQ plus community is its diversity. However, it's also important to recognize the impact of holding multiple marginalized identities can have on a person. So minority stress occurs in the LGBTQ plus population as a whole, as well as compounded minority stress among people of color. QT BIPOC is a phrase, queer, transgender people of color. So you may see that acronym used. Individuals living with disabilities and chronic health concerns, immigrants and refugees, poor and low income individuals, indigenous and two-spirit individuals, folks from rural communities and faith communities. So this is especially true for transgender people of color. In 2020, about 44 transgender or gender non-conforming people were fatally shot or killed by violent means, the majority of which were Black and Latinx transgender women. That comes from the Human Rights Campaign. Some studies, however, underscore the fact that individuals with multiple identities may actually be better equipped to cope with minority stress factors because of a more complex self-concept and varied experiences that have involved adaptation and resilience, among other factors. Individuals who adopt a strong sexual minority identity may be better equipped to manage minority stressors, invalidate stereotypes, to dismiss or address perceived or actual homophobia or transphobia while affirming a positive self-evaluation. Minority status is also associated with important resources such as group solidarity and cohesiveness. Clinical applications such as affirmative-based practice are effective as they focus on defining coping strategies, affirming a positive self-identity, increase the ability to assess the effects of homophobia and transphobia and stigma on psychological functioning and health risk behavior. So it should come no surprise that members of the community are vulnerable to suicidal thoughts and behavior. Preventing suicide and enhancing resiliency is clearly one of the most crucial aspects of healthcare provision for LGBTQ plus patients. Health centers have an opportunity to provide programs and care with the goal of promoting self-acceptance, positive social engagement, and improved mental and physical health of members of the community. And actual suicide rates among LGBTQ folks are not known in many cases. So the statistics that we do see are not completely accurate because sexual orientation and gender identity are not reported on death records. So what we do know about suicidality among the community is through surveys in which people self-report suicide attempts and ideation. I know there is an ongoing effort to ensure that behavioral health centers, individual practices are collecting also the data with respect to a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. So it's not just about those forward-facing administrative practices, but it's also important for reporting that your organization may do to the state or other accrediting bodies so that information is available. Marie.
Thanks, Stephen. I'm going to talk a bit about suicidality in LGBTQ plus youth specifically, and starting out with some statistics again from the Trevor Project to frame the conversation. So LGB youth seriously contemplate suicide at almost 3 times the rate of heterosexual youth, and are almost 5 times as likely to have attempted suicide compared to heterosexual youth. And obviously that is a huge difference. And LGB youth who come from highly rejecting families are 8.4 times as likely to have attempted suicide as LGB peers who reported no or low levels of family rejection. And each episode of LGBT victimization, such as physical or verbal harassment or abuse, increases the likelihood of self-harming behavior by 2.5 times on average. And once again, I'll point out that the majority of these statistics do not specifically include transgender youth, just simply because the research isn't there. But overwhelmingly, they are impacted by this at a higher rate than anyone else in the queer community. And we will touch a little bit more on that later. So talking about some of the risk factors for LGBTQ plus youth, obviously family and peer rejection on the basis of sexual or gender orientation can have an extreme impact. I'm sure that comes as a surprise to no one. As I've stated already, lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth who reported higher levels of family rejection compared to peers from families that reported no levels or low levels of family rejection were 8.4 times more likely to report having attempted suicide. And they were also 5.9 times more likely to report high levels of depression, 3.4 times more likely to use illegal drugs, and 3.4 times more likely to report having engaged in unprotected sexual intercourse. So having a supportive adult in a child's life is one of the single most important protective factors against behavioral health concerns. And then as well, LGBTQ plus youth have a higher prevalence of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, which are things like trauma or stressful life events that occur before the age of 18. And so those are all things like childhood abuse or neglect or household dysfunction. And LGB individuals report a higher prevalence of ACEs, but also more frequent patterns of abuse and polyvictimization in their lives. So research also shows that the more gender nonconforming a kid is, the more likely they are to experience abuse. And it's also multiracial folks tend to carry the most ACEs as well. So just to put it in perspective, 41.6% of LGB kids report 4 or more ACEs compared to 25.3% of heterosexual youth. And so a higher prevalence of ACEs increases the likelihood of having a mental health or substance use disorder, which in turn increases suicidality. And then as a result of family rejection, being kicked out of the house, discrimination, criminalization, a lot of other factors, LGBTQ plus youth represent about 40% of the homeless youth population. And of that population, studies indicate that as many as 60% are likely to attempt suicide. And on top of that, rates of substance abuse are 2 to 5 times higher among LGBTQ plus youth than in their heterosexual peers. And that also increases their risk of suicidality. And this is particularly true for those homeless youth whose risk of substance use is even higher. And finally, generic policies in schools just don't sufficiently protect LGBTQ plus students from bullying and harassment. 40% of LGB youth have experienced bullying compared to 21% of their heterosexual peers. And a report from the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network suggests that including key 3 elements in school or in district policies will help with some of these things. The first one is explicit prohibition against bullying based upon students' actual or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity. The second is professional development requirements for staff on bullying and harassment. And the third is accountability for incident reporting to the district and state. So all of these can be kind of directly attached to systems of care. So in the first one, having explicit statements in policy that discrimination or mistreatment won't be tolerated from anyone on staff, training all staff on how to provide culturally relevant care, and then third being holding staff accountable to those standards, having an anonymous way to get feedback from clients and peers, and making sure that those expectations are being upheld. And research also shows that schools with LGBTQ plus inclusive education, which includes stuff like receiving information about sexual orientation, learning about queer history, and discussion of LGBTQ plus current events, all of these things increases the likelihood of a student thinking their school is a safe place. So LGBTQ plus inclusive sex education is specifically associated with reduced suicidal ideation, increased mental health, and lower experiences of bullying among LGBTQ plus youth. And it actually, research shows that LGBTQ plus inclusive sex education is protective for youth of all identities related to suicidal thoughts, depression, and suicidal plans. And that actually all comes from CDPHE's Suicide Among Youth in Colorado report. So when you're working with youth, there's obviously going to be some unique barriers that impact that young person's ability to engage in care, and parents or caregivers can act as a support or a barrier. Maybe parents or caregivers are unsupportive or just don't understand their kids' interest or need to access care. Or maybe a young person is uncomfortable reaching out to their parent or caregiver, and they just don't have the means to access these services. And for those working in school settings, you can encounter restrictions that limit the type of care that can be provided to a young person in that setting. They usually are tied to school or district level policies, or even age restrictions on parental consent laws. So for instance, youth may not be able to see an in-school provider for therapy unless their parents allow it, even though the Colorado age of consent for psychotherapy is 12. So as I talked about in the last slide, schools are an incredibly important resource for youth in terms of behavioral healthcare access. So being able to understand how to navigate these systems in the best interest of a young person is really important for people in the school system. And then just like adults, youth have to face logistical challenges like how to navigate insurance, access services. If they don't have a supportive adult in their life to help them with those things, they have to figure them out. And as an adult, I struggle with those things. So I can't imagine for a youth. And as well, obviously, transportation and money is a huge barrier for youth as well. And so all of these things are important to keep in mind when thinking about how to offer care to youth.
And so LGBTQ, older adults and suicide. So it's an often overlooked population when discussing suicide are older LGBTQ folks, adults, 65 and older. Older adults in the general population accounted for close to 17% of fatal suicides, even though they currently make up about 15% of the total US population. Again, the percentage of completed suicides in the LGBTQ folks is unknown. However, older LGBTQ folks have endured a long life of stigmatization, and some studies have found higher rates among LGBTQ older adults compared to their straight peers. One last note, the health disparities that exist for LGBTQ plus elders are numerous. They're more likely to suffer from a chronic health condition and be diagnosed with a mental health concern. They are less likely to pursue help from a healthcare professional. And when they do seek medical care, the majority of the healthcare providers are not equipped to provide culturally relevant care. And then working with the transgender population. So, again, language comes into play. There's never a reason to use a person's legal name or the name that they were called before they transitioned or embrace their identity. Knowledge of trans-specific and related healthcare needs is also identified as an important quality of competent care, which translates into the ability to address trans-specific health needs. This could be related to treatment or support around gender dysphoria and gender-affirming care. And then again, moving slightly into the administrative side, providers should also have gender-neutral facilities, including restrooms, sleep and shower facilities, both within the office and clinical setting. So collecting data on marginalized populations. So as emphasized throughout this presentation, it's important to ask for sexual and gender identities of the clients coming through your doors, not only for the individual treatment, but also for the sake of data collection. You'll notice that we commented a few times on the lack of data, including for transgender individuals. There's a lot of LGB and not enough LGBT in research. So if it becomes routine to always collect this data, we'll be able to create interventions that take intersecting and marginalized identities into account. So here are some resources that are available to help support culturally relevant and affirming practices that you can put to work in supporting your LGBTQ clients. A few other thoughts about resources. It's helpful to maintain a strong referral system in your community to support LGBTQ plus individuals. This is helpful to provide ideas for additional supports, as well as knowing who else might be a good fit for an individual if you find that you're not in a good position to provide a clinical intervention. So that wraps up our presentation. I know we're running close to time, but really grateful, Sarah and the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment for inviting us in today to share, the importance of providing supportive and affirming care to members of the LGBTQ plus community.
Yeah, I just want to say we appreciate all of your time and everyone's commitment to this work. I know we don't have a ton of time left, but we are open to any questions if anybody has some. I can stop sharing.
Thank you both. That was really excellent. I know that sometimes this group takes a while to unmute themselves or type questions into the chat. So feel free to type those questions in. I think you provided a lot of really helpful information for how systems can think about changes to their care, changes to how they're setting up their forms to be more inclusive, just as that first introduction to their healthcare system. I think that's a low-hanging fruit for all of us to think about, and also not even just on the client side, but also thinking about staff who are working in these organizations also bring identities into the workplace. So Barbara had a question that Marie or Stephen, if you have anything specific, are there any upcoming trainings that folks should be aware of in this space?
Well, I know specifically for our training, we're having one virtual one a month, and that's been going since February. And we're also going to be looking at having in-person trainings this fall in Denver specifically. As far as other opportunities, that is a good question. Nothing immediately comes to mind for me. I don't know about you, Stephen.
Yeah, anything specifically related to suicide prevention is not, we probably should have come prepared with a list. We don't have one, but we're happy to do some research and follow up with Sarah. I know the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment has some trainings scheduled for later this year, if I recall correctly. And so there may be an opportunity for us to partner together to shed some additional light on the concerns that we've talked about today.
And Marie, is your website the best spot for folks to go get more information around those behavioral health provider trainings?
I saw that you posted the link to the website in the chat. I can also specifically link the landing page for the training program.
Awesome, thank you. And I think Don had a question around any references for the clinical critiques for the minority stress that you mentioned. Not to put you on the spot for a bibliography, but is there somewhere that folks could easily access that if they want to?
We can certainly provide that as part of the research that we put together for this presentation. Is that something that we can share with you, Sarah, and that would be available to distribute to everyone that's joined us today?
Excellent, thank you. It looks like Don's already on the research hunt, looking to learn more about that, which is great. Excellent. Well, thank you both again for your time this morning and for sharing all of that information with us. I really appreciated how you acknowledged that this community is not a monolith, that all of these identities intersect across the age span, across different cultural identities as well. So I think that was really helpful in just expanding our knowledge base around that. For folks on the call, our next learning collaborative will be next month, July, let me get my date right, the 22nd, so the 4th Thursday, and I promise to be more on the ball with not changing the Zoom links or getting more passcodes at the last minute, so it should all be up to date now. So that will again be from 10 to 11 on the 4th Thursday. And we'll get these slides and the recording posted to our Zero Suicide website. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks again. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, everybody.